It is Friday, September 6th. Let's talk PlayStation. Welcome back, everyone, to another Astro episode of LTPS. Very big day for PlayStation, of course, because we have Astro Bot coming out right now on PS5. So if you are picking it up later today, playing it right now, maybe over the weekend, then enjoy yourself, truly. It does seem like we have a very special game on our hands, and we will talk about that later. But first, as always, a very brief reminder for the PS Plus Essential September lineup, which those games are now live on PSN, so you can go ahead and add those to your library. And also, we should probably mention that for PS Plus Extra, there are 4 more games that were added last minute to the Last Chance to Play section. So now you have less than 2 weeks left to play the 12 games we talked about before, but now it's 16 total with these 4 new titles, that being Unpacking, 13 Sentinels, Sniper Ghost Warrior Contracts 2, and Planet Coaster. Now, I've complained about this before, I'll do it again. Why are we not making sure the exact list is updated a month out properly, so that way you know exactly what games are going to be leaving and how much time left you do have, and a month is a very good courtesy. You know, something like 13 Sentinels, which is arguably the best game in there out of the 4 new ones that are leaving, that takes like, I don't know, what is it, 25, 40 something hours to get through that game, depending on how, your own personal pace. And now you've got less than 2 weeks. God forbid you were looking to play that game. It's just, it's borderline infuriating. Can we not make sure the list is actually the correct list and we don't throw things in last minute? It's got to be some sort of weird automated system. I don't know what's going on in the back end, but somebody has to check in on this thing and make sure that, hey, as a courtesy, a month out, here's what's actually leaving, and we're not just, throwing things in last minute. But anyway, moving on to our first news story with something that is kind of adjacent to PS Plus and classic games and streaming. It's a separate new service launching today on PS4, PS5, and it's called Antstream, which it's not entirely new. It's launching today on PlayStation, but it's been available on Xbox and iOS for a long time now, or a number of years, I think, at this point. But it is a retro game streaming service, and it's separate from Sony. They're not, there's no affiliation with Sony. What they have is a very, very large library of 1,300 games, which are primarily a lot of old things. So it is, across platforms like the Amiga, multiple Ataris, arcade, C64, DOS. There is some Game Boy and Genesis stuff on there, and the NES, but, it's got other platforms like the ZX Spectrum. There's a small selection of PS1 games, but just to really punch home here that it's a lot of like very retro pre-90s stuff or around the 90s, games like that. So there's an annual fee for $39.99, and that's the same price across USD, Euro, and British Pound. And I think they're still offering the lifetime access where it's a one-time fee for $99.99. Same thing across Euro, USD, and British Pound Sterling. So not entirely a bad thing if you're into those kind of games. I would even argue that if you're okay with streaming them, then this is a really cool way to, let's say drop $40 and then just really have a lot of video game history at your fingertips. But obviously that's going to be highly dependent on your own experience with streaming, which by and large is still going to be very hit and miss for some people depending on that connection, and also Antstream's own services, which I've not had the chance to really check out, but now that it's available on PlayStation, I might end up doing that. Maybe if there's time in between Astro, I'll do an upload on it and check out what's going on there. But if you're into that kind of thing, then it is a lot of stuff, and I will always advocate for the modern playability of certain games that are generally out of reach for most people if you're not just straight up emulating the stuff on PC. If you're primarily a console player, it's very easy, accessible, so great to have that on PlayStation. Okay, let's just get right into it, huh? Astro Bot reviews. This game did exceptionally well, to the point where not only is it the best reviewed game of this year so far, but it's also one of the best reviewed PlayStation games in PlayStation history. So over on Metacritic, across 100 different reviews, it's sitting at a 94, and then across 75 different reviews, it's a 95 on OpenCritic. So it's certainly in that upper echelon of some of the best reviewed stuff ever. And, it's kind of what we said before. It's very impressive when nowadays it's very tough for any game to break the 90 plus barrier. So typically if something's in the 80 range, like that's very good because there's so many publications nowadays versus 20 years ago that's in that aggregate. So if something was good 20 years ago, you're talking about 10 to 15 publications, chances are the higher score is going to average out more often versus what we see nowadays. So to break 90 and be in that 94, 95 range is crazy. And we're seeing a lot of interesting quotes and proclamations, not even so much the matter of like, oh, it's Game of the Year or it's a Game of the Year contender, which that very much I think is like a minimum guaranteed given how well it did score, but other quotes that are ranging from it's the best platformer I ever played, the best PlayStation game I ever played, or it just speaks to that receptor in your brain where it's like, this is why video games are fun. It sort of sparks that same joy and an appreciation for our medium. It's, of course, a celebration of PlayStation history. You know, these things all in a way sound like hyperboles, but everyone's standing by their word and saying, no, this game does hit. And that is very encouraging to see. I mean, I was always a very big proponent of Astro Bot and just 3D platformers and colorful platformers like this. So no doubt I'm very excited. I cannot wait to like wrap this up and then play a lot of Astro Bot this coming weekend, which again, I will film my entire playthrough. I'm not sure when I will get that done and uploaded, but considering we do know the game's in the neighborhood of like 8 to 12 hours, and even if the platinum does not take that much longer, I'm sure that's very doable for me, and I'll probably have that wrapped up, and that could be potentially a Tuesday or Wednesday upload. Again, it really depends on how the timing works out, but you know, I'm happy also to hear that the window for the time to play this game is also not incredibly long. I mean, for a platformer, those tend to be around that range anyway. So there's this, you know, this ongoing conversation too about Team Asobi, how much the game cost to make and the viability of it, how it was only in development for 3 years, how well is it going to do, which I think the game, we're getting some early indicators that the game actually is going to do quite well. The sort of benchmark is like, okay, something like Ratchet and Clank, which for PlayStation, that's our only other, and really for the entire games business, our only other AAA, you know, colorful platformer type game. Ratchet's a very well-known entity, and that, you know, to a degree was only able to do initially a few million, right? So with Astro Bot, where it's still technically unproven in a way where it's like costing money for most folks in a 2D environment, we're not sure how well it'll do, but I hope that it is in that million range. The million plus range, I think, is maybe a safe bet. I mean, ideally, I'd love to see this thing do absolute gangbusters, but I think one thing we can safely say is that Astro is looking very strong. We should also add as a separate story, there is the confirmation of post-launch DLC in the form of like challenge rooms and speedrun levels, so I think they are going to hopefully do a lot of that stuff, because with Astro's Playroom, it was cool to have a lot of those speedrun challenges in there as well. In other PlayStation Celebration news, we can also mention the 30th anniversary coming up very soon, this December, and Sony is finally talking about what they're planning on doing for the celebration itself, which this is some initial plans, so I think they are going to certainly announce more things in the coming months, but for now, this is what they are talking about, which is My First GT. So that's going to be a new trial version for Gran Turismo 7, which is going to feature cars, tracks, and race events that evoke the same nostalgia and excitement from the first Gran Turismo. That's coming to PS4 and PS5 this holiday season. Then there's digital game soundtracks. Those are getting released in collaboration with Sony Music. So each month from October to January, they're going to release a new set of soundtracks from different PlayStation franchises. So that's going to include things like God of War 1 and 2, God of War Ghost of Sparta, Twisted Metal, Warhawk, Starhawk, and Unit 13. Next is the Shapes of Play collection. So these are going to be physical products that you can actually like hold and mess around with. So there's the Shapes of Play Battle, which is a board game with PlayStation buttons. Then there's the Shapes of Play Create, and that's going to be like magnetic blocks that you can, again, just sort of move around and play with and whatnot. Then there's Shapes of Play Recharge, and these look like stress balls, and these are going to come out in December, and pre-orders start today. So the Create is $79.99, Battle is $44.99, and Recharge is $34.99 USD. Now, they're also going to run a free multiplayer weekend coming up on the 21st and the 22nd, and they're going to host tournaments in NBA 2K24, NBA 2K25, Madden 24, MLB 24, UFC 5, Tekken 8, and Guilty Gear Strive. And also those participating in the tournaments are going to get some 30th anniversary avatars as well. So that's what they've outlined so far, and there is going to be more. They pretty much said that in the PS blog. So it's not just this stuff, especially considering I think you look at this and you go, okay, My First GT is like cool, but that's clearly a marketing thing for more PlayStation or for more Gran Turismo players. The tournaments, they do that quite often. Soundtrack's very cool, but also the shapes thing is, I don't know, it's weird. It's clearly a collector's item because in a way it's like a very obscure avant-garde product or range of products that are like, you know, again, stress balls or magnet blocks and things like that. So they look cool, but they're kind of pricey for what they are. I think a lot of folks are sitting here wondering, like, okay, let's see them do something similar with the 20th anniversary edition PlayStation 4. So maybe some gray console covers and a gray DualSense, which I would love to see. Not sure if they're doing that, but considering they are going to talk more at some point, let's hope that the celebration announcements really ramp up from here, because with these alone, it's like nice, but I think they're going to be announcing some more exciting stuff in the coming months. Now, we also simply cannot ignore here that Sony also very intentionally just teased the PlayStation 5 Pro in that marketing material that they put out for the 30th anniversary, because the one image that they did use is the 30th anniversary logo, and then in the background there's all those various PlayStation consoles, handhelds, accessories as a low opacity silhouette. But if you do zoom in and enhance in this one area, you can make out very clearly a PlayStation 5 Pro, which we now know what the console looks like, because the week prior we had the Bilbo Coon sketch put out where we saw the basic PS5 Pro product design, and now we can compare that to an official image from Sony. And yeah, it seems like a pretty open and shut case. So not only was Sony probably planning on doing this because it's marketing material, it's not like they probably decided last minute, like, okay, let's mess with people. We don't really get teases like this too often, but at times they will do it, which is always fun. And so this was probably like going to be happening either way, which if anything, it would have been maybe more interesting to not get the Bilbo Coon sketch, because this would be something that people would still find and wonder, like, what is that? Because it doesn't look like anything that we have so far in the PlayStation hardware lineup, but it's still like very similar enough to a PS5 Slim where it just looks like a larger version of it. So I think people probably would have still had the same conclusion. But I think that's a good segue to our next news story here, which simply is, Sony planned on doing that. We're already done with week 1 of September. We're hearing that PS5 Pro is expected for the first half of September. It would seem more and more clear that we are at the very minimum 1 week away from this announcement, mere days away probably. If anything, maybe it would be another week out or something, but it sounds like we're probably going to hear about this thing the following week. And now it's simply a big waiting game on how they're going to do it. I guess we know what it looks like, obviously, but how much are they going to say? Are they going to confirm price right away? Again, we always compare this to PS4 Pro because that's the only benchmark. But considering that is the only one time that they did do it, it really is still kind of a wild west, because the PS5 console cycle in general has had a lot of abnormalities and different, sort of press materials put out versus what they did with PlayStation 4. So it may not be a guarantee that we have this hour-long sort of press event. It might simply be something that's a little bit more bare bones, like a PlayStation blog announcement and then separate trailers uploaded to YouTube or whatever the case is, showing off PS5 Pro enhanced games, or a Mark Cerny conversation. It really, I think there's a lot of possibilities on how they could do this, but we're very close to finding out anyway. The other angle that we can mention is that we also, I guess, now knowing that PS5 Pro is probably very close, that Jeff Grubb from Giant Bomb, he also outlined further exactly where the state of play should be expected, which he says around the last week of September. Now, the thing is, that's also TGS, where that starts on the 26th. So in theory, that means we can probably expect the state of play is going to happen anywhere between the 22nd to the 23rd, although I guess they could do it during the first day of TGS and do it on the 26th. But I think we've got a very good, possible timeline of how this month is going to shake out, where there's a lot happening for PlayStation right now. So with that in mind, we're very close to all this stuff going on. As a separate aside, I can also say for TGS, and I just thought this was so cool, but we do have the father of PlayStation, Ken Kutaragi, going to be doing a keynote on the 26th for the start of TGS. TGS as well, which is amazing because Ken is somebody that is a very fascinating person. Of course, he's so important to PlayStation history, but he also very rarely does public speaking or just any sort of public appearances in general. So whenever he does show up, I think it's always worth mentioning and taking a look at. So he'll be talking with another speaker and going over like the future of the games business and where the industry is right now. Not sure if it's going to be like a very big or long conversation, but it's like an opening keynote kind of thing, which will be very fun to see Ken out there again. All right, moving on to some not so good news here for Ballistic Moon, the second-party PlayStation Studios developer currently working on Until Dawn for PS5 and PC. The company recently had to confirm a number of layoffs where over on LinkedIn they say, and I quote here, "It is with deep regret and heavy heart that we must make the tough decision to significantly scale down our team to secure the future of our studio. This comes after our development of Until Dawn for PS5 and PC." Ballistic Moon, of course, is still a relatively new studio. They were formed back in 2019 or 20, somewhere around there, and they're not really a big studio either. I think they only laid off like 11 or 12 people, and in the context of what they're saying, that they had to significantly scale down based on 10 to 11 people. Not to say that makes it any better, but it sounds like they're certainly trying to be very proactive in terms of, as they say, making sure the studio survives in what is a really tough environment right now for many other studios, where even if you ship a really successful game, there's no guarantee you can live through that, which is just so cynical and awful, but that's the reality that we have nowadays. But I will say, I mean, this does happen quite often, even during a healthy environment, where when you ship a game, you know, once you start working on your next project, and I think they do have another one in the pipeline, but even if they don't, let's say they don't have something lined up, you've got a lot of people sitting around doing nothing. If you do have another project that you're just starting up, that's still only a handful of people, and then you've got designers, artists, programmers all kind of sitting around just straight up not doing anything, because the early process of conceptualizing a game, you only need a handful of people. That's why some of these more larger established studios have this sort of framework where you've got a lot of people primarily working on one game, wrapping it up, and then naturally that team size starts to shift over to the new project, and that's how you just have those things where one game comes out, then maybe 3-4 years later the other team can get something going in a full steam ahead kind of work pipeline, you know what I mean? So with Ballistic Moon being fairly new, they're probably just trying to make sure they can navigate this in a way where they stay alive, despite Until Dawn not even shipping yet on PlayStation 5 and PC. It sounds like they're trying to be very proactive. So it's unfortunate, but hopefully they do come out of this, the other side, alive. Next up, let's talk about Concord, where, as most of you probably know, the game's not doing well, and we had a very big announcement on Tuesday where, as a quick recap, Sony did step in and shut the game down. So it is completely delisted, they ceased sales, refunds went out automatically on Steam, Epic Game Store, and PSN. They also encouraged refunds from third-party retailers if you bought a disc, and the game is now officially offline. They did say they would put it down within 3 days from the announcement. So the sort of aftermath there, funny enough, is that for a lot of people that were playing the game, it was like, all right, well, let's try and lock in the Platinum Trophy. So I guess what was happening is that every single lobby, people were just like mass suiciding in the game, because that was the fastest way to progress games and earn XP, because one trophy you have to like get to level 100 or something with a character, so that's like the most optimal way to do it. So for the few people that were on the game, it was just like this well understood thing across different lobbies to just kill yourself immediately. So shout out to anybody that was actually doing that and got a platinum. That is likely going to be one of the rarest platinums in PlayStation history, and certainly one that is a cool snapshot in PlayStation history with that date tag on it as well. The other consequence is that the physical copies of the game are now being scalped, because what we heard from analysts is that the game sold around 25,000 copies, that being 10,000 on Steam, 15,000 on PlayStation 5, but PS5, of course, that would include digital and physical, so that's a smaller number for physical. And this is also something where, in terms of pure circulation of how many discs were made, this still is going to track with like pre-orders itself yourself, like Sony's not going to manufacture 1 million discs if they know they don't even have close to that number for pre-orders. So very likely there's a small amount of like discs actually in circulation, which means there was mass hysteria for the disc now. So people are running to GameStops and buying it, ordering it online, and now it commands a higher price on the secondhand market where people are trying to scalp Concord, a disc which in theory is useless. I'm sure there's some content on there. I actually don't have one just yet because that's my collector brain. Had no interest in the game whatsoever, but like literally the second that announcement was put out, maybe within 20 minutes that hit me. I'm like, oh yeah, that's going to happen to the disc because there's not many in circulation. So I did order one at MSRP before it all got wiped out, and so my copy is arriving well after the shutdown date, so I will never be able to experience the game. But that's the conversation I guess we can have in the aftermath of Concord now being officially offline, is that will this game even come back? So the Tuesday conversation that I had, I mean, my gut reaction at the time was like, oh, based on Sony's own language here, is that they were going to explore options to reach more players. Now, I guess in theory that means they're going to explore those options and maybe come to the conclusion that they won't do that, but I find it pretty interesting that when this news dropped, the general consensus was, no, it's done and it's not coming back. It's like, well, they just said they're going to try and figure it out, but I mean, I'm sure Sony knows what we all know here, which is even if you make the game free to play, that is not going to change anything. And that's kind of why I thought, like, okay, so you make it free to play, that's step one, but step two has to be, what do you do after? Do you change the gameplay loop? Do you reskin the game? Are you willing to bankroll that? So the more time goes on here, I guess I am getting more in that mindset of like, yeah, maybe they won't bring this game back. Like that really is we'll take the L and that's basically it. I think what's more telling is that we're seeing from some Firewalk devs that they did not really know what was going to happen, or rather they don't know what comes next, which is pretty illustrative of this was an SIE decision, and maybe only a select few that are more senior management at Firewalk were a part of that conversation on, okay, what are we going to do with this game? Because even if we continue selling it, like just nobody can play it because there's no players. So the whole thing, it's just insane. It's not just for the history books and PlayStation history, but it's like for the entire games business. The way that this happened, it's absolutely nuts. And also apparently we're hearing that from IGN, we're hearing that the Concord episode for the Amazon Secret Level TV series, that's still happening, which I guess is fine because it can stand alone by itself. It's not like that somehow has to go away too, obviously. It's just like one episode that is likely already made at this point. So if this game came out, I guess you can put that out too, right? That's not really going to do anybody any harm. But we'll keep following this and see what happens. But it is interesting to consider that maybe Concord is just not going to come back. Now, understandably, a byproduct of this entire thing is people now talking about Fairgames and Haven Studios and wondering how's that game going to turn out when that trailer also had a not very good debut, and a lot of people are mostly uninterested in that game as well. So we recently had some comments from Christopher Dring of GamesIndustry.biz, where he was speaking with his one co-host, James Batchelor, for a GI Microcast episode, and they were talking about Sony's current live service roadmap and their games, and Chris was talking about and theorizing that with Concord, that game might have been basically sent out to die. But in terms of Fairgames, and he touched on this studio, he said, and I quote here, "I've heard good things about Jade Raymond's game. Is it Fairgames? I've heard good things about that. So there's a few. I know people who are a bit skeptical about the trailer, but I've heard internal chatter is very positive about it. So there are these other projects that I assume that the ones that they're focusing on are the ones that they're going to go for. They're going to put out there, they're going to support and try to make work." Now, it's important to clarify that this was filmed before the Concord announcement, but still during a time where the game did come out, and so that's what they're getting at, is how Sony knew it was not going to do well and probably sent it out there to die, which there's still something to be said about how the game came out in the first place when you consider years of development, milestone builds, play testing, focus testing. There's still all that to consider, yes, but more recently, Sony would know, based off pre-orders and the beta, that, yeah, the game's probably going to fail, and they still sent it out there to die. So that's why the context is, well, Concord they knew would do bad, but these other games that they're settling on, including Fairgames, those there might be a bigger level of commitment and thinking that maybe those games will work. Which the very important context to consider is that they're discussing how Sony's live service plans have already changed, even before Concord. This is kind of what we always circle back to with this vicious, cyclical conversation surrounding Sony's live service plans in general, is that regardless of Concord's failure, they were already navigating this in a way where they're learning that live service is tough, right? Because before Concord even came out, they've already had a handful of things happen, with London Studio shutting down, Twisted Metal getting canceled, Last of Us Online getting canceled, Destruction All-Stars failed, Helldivers 2 was a success, they acquired Bungie, saw Bungie financials, they absorbed their back-end office operations, the 12 live service games they were planning on shipping by fiscal year 25 have been delayed already, half of them being pushed out because 3 of them are already canceled. All these things, or nearly most of them, happened before Concord pre-orders even went up. So it's not going to take Concord for them to have some kind of U-turn or this revelation that, oh, maybe this isn't for us or something, because I know that's what people want from the whole Concord thing, or just in general, which again, I can always sympathize with, people that don't want live service, or they're also in fear of the implications of, let's say, multiple successful live service games. We can't ignore that if they do have a number of them that actually are doing well, that would maybe motivate the company to continue investing in that area and say not single player. I understand the concerns. The issue is they've still, to this day, not actually shown that that's going to happen based on as recent as this week, which is we somehow had a week where Concord, a 5v5 live service hero shooter, had the biggest public failure a game could possibly have, and then you have a semi AAA, 3D platformer, colorful single player game, 8 to 12 hours, get reviewed exceptionally well, which is really still kind of in the vein of what Sony has always been known for with PlayStation Studios, which is industry leading single player games. And these things both happened within the same week. It's simply still to this day not a matter of one being a higher priority than the other. They want to expand, and they've still been doing this with this most recent example. So it's, Concord is not going, certainly things are going to change with Concord. There's no doubt in my mind about that. I think there's going to be some processes in place that maybe try to prevent a Concord from happening again. So it's not like things aren't going to change from that, but I guess in the grander conversation surrounding Sony's commitment and investment in live service, even before Concord, they were already having this reckoning behind the scenes of this is expensive, we have to cancel certain games, some of these are not going to get over the finish line. So I don't know if there's much to really say going back to Fairgames. That game is going to fill a different niche. That's the other angle that we can't ignore as well, which is every single game so far is filling a different genre, right? They consider MLB a live service game. That's an annual baseball franchise, right? That's different. They tried a car combat game. Fairgames is going to be a heist PvE style game. So we can't just look at Concord and go, that's a blanket thing that we can apply to all the other games. We simply can't do that. We simply can never do that. So we're still going to get more live service, but I want to stress the company has still not really shown this lack of commitment to single player. If anything, it's still really great that we had something like Astro Bot. And yeah, buy more of that game and vote with your wallet so they at least know that they can experiment more with these sort of less risky, not nearly as financially advantageous projects, and keep them in-house. Because that's the other thing I'll always remind people of too. They just partner with a lot of outside studios nowadays for a Can of Bridge of Spirits or Stray, Chia. I say this a lot because those games fill the role of what PlayStation used to do in-house. So it's we still get those games, they're just not in-house. But Astro Bot is certainly a return to that kind of game within SIE. So it's going to be great to know that maybe they'll do more of that, but that does not mean less live service. It simply doesn't. Now, moving on to a somewhat related news story here, the Sony Group Chairman and CEO, Kenichiro Yoshida, and Hiroki Totoki, the Sony Group CFO, COO, and the president, were speaking with the Financial Times and talking about how they want to invest more in IP, and actually saying they feel like they don't have enough IP. So, Hiroki was quoted saying, "Whether it's for games, films, or anime, we don't have that much IP that we fostered from the beginning. We're lacking the early phase of IP, and that's an issue for us." Now, the context here is that Sony has historically been better at reaching a global audience for content that was already popular in Japan, and more so the article touches on how Sony is still in this position where, for things like TV and film, they sell a lot of this stuff to other providers instead of, say, making their own service. So Yoshida said, and I quote here, "By putting our efforts in creation, that also means that we will work with our partners on the distribution side. So I think we have developed very good relationships with the so-called big tech players." So really interesting words there from Sony leadership, more so when you consider that even though these things tend to be a very broad sense because this is the entire Sony group that they're speaking on, you do have Totoki, specifically naming out games across games, films, anime, and that's the problem he feels, is that they don't have enough original IP that they foster from the very beginning, which it's always one of those things where, to me, that strikes me as a slight disconnect, or at the very minimum, he's phrasing it in a way where he's hyper-focused on, and he's the CFO, that's his background primarily. So he's hyper-focused on some of the upper echelon of products that come out of SIE. So like in recent years, like a lot of the big, like high-earning stuff from SIE is really the late PlayStation 4 cycle and up. So that's your Uncharted, your Spider-Man, your Last of Us, and things like that, right? So there's only a handful of games when you look at the like really big revenue earners for Sony Interactive. But the disconnect would be, like, in terms of IP, they have a boatload of it, especially for PlayStation, especially for a game they just put out that is a love letter to PlayStation history and showcases various different properties that you own, that you made and fostered from the very beginning since 1994, right? So it's a little bit weird there, but that's also like him being the CFO, and that's his background. It's not like, this is Kaz Hirai saying this, where he came from Sony Computer Entertainment and then led the entire organization. So it's like he's valid in one way, not so valid in the other, but Yoshida is right with how they've been approaching just IP in general and content creation. It still appears to me as though that was like a smart play to not go down this path of like, we got to have our own streaming service. No, let's just be the provider of content and just take all these checks from all the big players that are still fending for themselves, trying to make that bottom line really pencil out. It seems like they're still pretty committed to doing that, and I think that's probably the right play. Moving on to yet another update for the Black Myth Wukong exclusivity, not exclusivity thing. I really did not think it would get this far, but we do have another update here. So there was an additional statement sent to Paul Tossi, writing for Forbes, providing more context and a little bit more clarity as to what's going on with this game. So they say, and I quote here, "As we have said before, we're excited for the launch of Black Myth Wukong on Xbox Series XS and are working with Game Science to bring the game to our platforms. We'd prefer not to comment on the deals made by our partners with other platform holders, but we can confirm that the delay is not due to Xbox platform limitations that have been raised to us." So the running theory here is that Sony was perhaps providing resources to Game Science in order to help them get the game out the door on time for PlayStation, making this not some kind of traditional console exclusivity agreement, but rather they were willing to step in and help optimize the PS5 version of the game, which they're clearly not going to do that for the competing platform, and that is something Sony is known to do. They will step in, send engineers, or provide some kind of resources and help and feedback to help optimize and work on certain games, and certainly ones that are maybe a bit more high profile. But we also have Digital Foundry weighing in on this story, and they're stating that they've heard that there is some kind of agreement in place based on sources with good knowledge of the situation. But they do also submit that that may not be the only reason, as optimizing on Xbox Series S could be a part of it, or at the very least, a delay could benefit that version in a way the PS5 version did not necessarily get, since that one is still a little bit problematic. So again, I did not expect another update on this story, but sure enough, we have more evidence maybe pointing us in the direction of it was an agreement, but it still is so weird. Now, here's the thing, right? The running theory about Sony stepping in, providing resources, like they do that. They do that very often. So that does make sense. The reason why I did not think to bring that up last week is that how does that happen, right? And then, which very well probably did happen. But how does that happen and that gets misconstrued as some kind of exclusivity agreement? Or how did that in turn maybe became, some kind of dotted line agreement of, okay, now you're barred from shipping on Xbox for 6 months or something. And the thing is too, it does also happen where there's exclusivity arrangements where it's not explicitly this mass marketing blowout that you sometimes see, like all those trailers I showed for B-roll last week. There's a handful of games, a lot of games probably, where that's often the case, where there is an agreement and it's like a more of a low-key thing. But that's almost always reserved for just straight up smaller games. Black Myth Wukong is by no stretch a small game. It's very high profile. If Sony wanted to, get that game exclusive and sort of pay for it, you would think they would go for the full-blown marketing association, but that was not really the case. Usually it's like the hero projects, whether it's like India, China, or Middle East. Those games are all going to have that stipulation. If Sony gives you a dev kit and they give you all these resources and funding, and they give you a grant, you're gonna agree to not ship on Xbox for 6 months to a year or something like that. And those games are not all going to be guaranteed massive PlayStation Association trailers and all that stuff, right? So that's true. But the whole thing is still very weird. And I also find it a bit strange that we've now got so many different publications chiming in going, well, we have a source saying this. It's like, now how does this many people somehow have a source to like a Chinese developer, and if they do or do not have some kind of exclusivity agreement? Now, surely it's more on the PlayStation side of things. And there's the other angle of Microsoft now doubling down 3 times on this statement, and that's a PR message. At a certain point, you would think they want to make sure they're sending the right message, and then there's still plausibility on the way they're phrasing the message, which is the concerns have not been raised to us. So it's like, oh, so Game Science didn't approach you. It's like there's so much like word soup being thrown around here. At this point, I'm kind of checked out of the whole story. I would still be very surprised if it was actually an agreement, but I don't think we'll ever find out, because Sony's not going to say that, obviously. But usually if it's a big game, they put it out there in plain view. So I doubt we'll have many examples like this, but this was just a very weird one to see play out. Now, with all that said, it is time for Let's Talk Plus, the weekly Let's Talk PlayStation giveaway, where one of you can win a $10 PSN code. I would like to congratulate this viewer right here. I'll be contacting you very soon via email or X, and if you'd like to win a $10 PSN code, it is so simple. Follow the link down below, enter the Gleam giveaway, and supporting this channel a number of ways can gain you an entry, and I'll announce the winner next week, because I'm trying to help pay for your games. Those are all the stories from this past week that I wanted to talk about with you all, and we had 2 uploads recently. That was Astro's Playroom on Sunday, cleaning up the special VIP bot trophies, and then Tuesday was the Concord breaking news. We, of course, had to talk about that right away. And then coming up, we will probably do Astro Bot. I just don't know when I can reasonably get that done, but I can't wait to play that game, and maybe we'll also check in on Antstream and play that for a little bit too, and maybe do like a early thoughts, impressions kind of thing. But otherwise, that is pretty much it. So that concludes this week's episode of Let's Talk PlayStation. I'm Ryan Benecki. Thank you all so much for talking with me, and I will see you all next Friday.